right, so this is our final field visit of this round. We're on the steps of the state capitol of Colorado. And before I get into all of that, I had a couple things that I forgot in the last video to mention about Peter Thiel and Palantir. One is that Thiel has been identified in recent years as sort of a political rainmaker for the Republican Party, which is interesting to me because, he's a Silicon Valley guy, and on the surface, it doesn't necessarily seem to be, a great match with the Republican Party. But I think it's important to understand that moving forward, the whole technological social engineering element that's advancing tied to digital identity and what works government, they really need the conservatives on board. Because really the last 2 years have shown that the liberals and the progressives don't get that the underpinning of these social impact markets is really very devious and not meant to actually help people. They just listen to the superficial dialogue, that's on your local NPR station, right? And that's on the liberal media. And they believe and trust people that somehow, despite these terrible power imbalances and the rollout of this militarized technology, that things are going to improve for vulnerable populations. And I can't begin to explain why they think that is, but there's been no indicator over the last 2 years that the progressive liberal left is going to come along anytime soon. So they've got that pretty much locked up for the moment. And then you've got the conservatives who are still framing everything within the context of liberation and deregulation. And, and they're the ones who are mostly asserting sort of buffer zones against the rising biosurveillance state. But they are doing that from a frame that's not one that I share necessarily. I mean, they're doing probably the correct thing for reasons that I'm not really aligned with. So they need educating. But essentially, the biosurveillance state needs to pull in the conservatives. And so then in that context, I think it makes sense that Peter Thiel is being that rainmaker at the moment, and that there's such an emphasis within the blockchain crypto space to be going after red states or sort of purple states like Colorado, states like Wyoming, Montana, Utah, get them on board with this understanding that somehow these decentralized technologies are going to preserve their rights and their access to free markets. When really the free markets are not going to be for your everyday person, it's going to be free markets for AI-driven hedge fund portfolios. That's who the free markets are going to be for. So I just wanted to sort of get that clear. Oh, and one last thing is that Peter Thiel actually purchased he has multiple homes in multiple places, but he did purchase an $18 million mansion in Miami last year. And Miami, in Florida in general, and Miami specifically, are very much aligned with the crypto blockchain space. As is Colorado, every, different nodes are prominent, but the Learning Economy Foundation, their test lab for digital education and human capital finance, one of the test beds is here, C Lab in Colorado, and then the other one is actually in Broward County, which is sort of just outside of Miami. So Miami is sort of the crucible for a lot of the blockchain space and a launching pad for what's happening in Central America and Latin America in that space. So that's sort of just a continuation on the my last visit. So the thing that I talk about a lot that most people don't is this pay for success finance. And I'm sure a lot of people might be like, yeah, it's just one of so many different kinds of legislation out there. Why is this piece important? It doesn't seem that important to me, given all that's underway. And, I gave a speech last summer in Tucson about smart cities and social impact finance and Internet of Things sensors, and how really what appears to be underway is the creation of a mixed reality video game where poor people are used as game pieces in this global financial market. And then ultimately the data will be used to attempt to catalyze the singularity and train the robots and perhaps feed into this Julius Stillman's World Institute Global Brain Project. As crazy as it sounds, that appears to be the way it's going. So pay for success is the parameters linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and digital identity. That's their through line. So the UN SDGs are the goals, that those are the rules of the game, and pay for success are sort of the terms of engagement in the game, and then we've got the digital identity that identify you as a character in the game. And so pay for success finance has to happen first. Those policies, the enabling legislation has to happen. The Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results Act, that gave seed money to start that going. And here in Colorado, Pay for Success legislation was passed in 2015. I think they initially started in 2014, they got some pushback, and then they moved to 2015. So that passed, and I'll just read off the representatives who were attached to that bill. Garnett and Rankin, Arndt, Becker, Duran, Fields, Hammer, Lee, Contine, Moreno, Pabin, Rosenthal, Roop, Salazar, Thurlow, Vigil, Williams, Winter, and Hullinghorst. And those are the reps. And then the senators were Johnston, Martinez, Humerick, Aguilar, Heath, Hill, Kefalas, Kerr, Scheffel, and Kaldman. And then it was signed into made active by Governor Hickenlooper at the time. And a major force behind that legislation were a group that were identified as Democrats for Education Reform. And in the hat that I was wearing early in my activism, I would say, these are people who want to privatize public education. But what I'm realizing is that really it's about turning vulnerable populations into these impact commodities, and this includes children. So as much as we were positioned to fight the education privatizers at the time, it's not really a fight between parents of charter schools and parents of public schools and parents of Catholic schools, because ultimately, through digital identity and choice vouchers and standardized curriculum, the plane will be leveled across the board, and all of the children will become these impact commodities trained to be digital citizens of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So it's important to know that Jared Polis, when he was still a senator, he was the one, there's an article from America Forward that was asserting getting pay for success provisions into the reauthorization of the ESEA, and that's the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that's vital. It feels like somewhat of a small footnote off to the side. But once that was embedded, now the whole education system, as well as support services around the community schools model, they can tap into children and pull them into the data dashboards and their families into the data dashboards when it comes to health services and mental health services and social support services like food assistance and housing that are being run through the schools. And that was done in a very intentional way, because when the data for the impact deals is collected in school settings, under FERPA, the Family Education Privacy Protection Act, it's much less protected actually than HIPAA, which is the health equivalent. So if this data was for mental health or other health services were collected in an out-of-school, informal institutional setting, they would be much better protected. So they need to pull all of that stuff into the school-based settings, or what is going to pass as school once they close down all the schools and turn it into anytime, anywhere learning. In 2017, there was a call by the state government of Colorado for innovative solutions for various nonprofits and stakeholders in the state to advance different kinds of evidence-based solutions for target populations, which at that time included child welfare-involved youth and youth that had been part of juvenile detention programs. So that was happening. Now, a major player in this space is something called Gary Community Ventures. It's led by Mike Johnston, who was a Colorado state senator between 2009 and 2017. He's an alum of Teach for America, and actually he helped found a small school in Thornton that was advancing something called an expeditionary learning model, which for most people who are stuck in, sit down with a Chromebook in a plexiglass cube and do your work, the standardized boring curriculum, like an expeditionary learning model seems like a dream, right? And what most people are understanding is that the intention was you create the problem and then you offer your solution. And so once they get digital identity and wearable technology and smart environments to the point that they have them, that project-based learning out in the environment will get them the next layer of data that they need. So it may seem like a wonderful option, but in reality, it's just creating opportunities for even more intense surveillance of children, digital surveillance, but just in new ways, not necessarily on your tablet or Chromebook. Now, this Gary Community Ventures, it was founded by Sam and Nancy Gary. Sam came out west in the 1950s looking to make a fortune in oil, and he did at the Bell Creek oil field in Montana. He started his philanthropy in 1976, which was originally called the Piton Foundation, and they were focused on social welfare programs and land conservation. So they were doing urban land conservancy, the Denver preschool program, a campaign for children, Colorado children, and then later children's healthcare access. And a lot of the social impact finance space is going to be linked to Medicaid and Medicare and provision of services, but again, as data commodities. So on the website of Gary Community Ventures, where Mike Johnston is currently the CEO, they have been working hard with Governor Polis with his support around something called House Bill 22-1295. And the idea, there you go, Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, mobility solutions, but conditional if you have your proper QR code. So this House bill is essentially meant to combine all of the early childhood systems into one department. And that's important because they need consolidation to advance the pay for success deals in early childhood. So this is called Better Beginnings Colorado, and I think it's moving forward in March of 2022. On the website of Gary Community Ventures, there's quite a lot of many stories about vaccination in schools, very much in line with the biosurveillance state. They also talk about absenteeism, which is a social impact market. They talk about social mobility of families, also an impact market, and school readiness impact market. So they've got all of these impact markets lined up. And I just want to say, when I was doing some work around sort of this ideal of the one world religion, or sort of this umbrella religion, because to take over the entire world from space as sort of this soft global coup, it's likely going to happen not in a giant militant, military engagement, but they want people just to yield themselves up to it. So it's going to be framed as peace and social justice and love, right? But with data under surveillance. I mean, they're not going to tell you that part. But so I was doing some research, and because of Ervin Laszlo, that Hungarian systems theorist I keep talking about, who is connected with Julius Stolman of the World Institute and the Global Brain Project, Ervin Laszlo was connected with the Bahai Faith, and that's a faith that came out of Persia in the early 19th century, and it combines science and religion. And so what Laszlo has said is that the Baha'i, that's going to be the religion moving forward because of its emphasis on science. And so faith, but specifically steeped in the scientific method. And so, it's when you look in the origins of Baha'i here in the United States, actually one of the earliest providers was supporters and financial supporters was Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst was the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, and her husband was a California senator who had made a bunch of money in mining the Black Hills. So Phoebe Hearst, her background, and this is how it all ties in, back to the 19-teens, and this is this long arc, is that she was the founder of the Parent-Teacher Association in the United States, and she and her colleagues were very active around kindergarten. And so, again, at one point in time, I would say, yes, of course, funding kindergarten, full kindergarten funding is an imperative, and we should have that. But knowing what I know about the metaverse and Human Plus and where all of this is headed, really they need to condition the children from these earliest ages. So Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten. And this ties in with the early childhood better beginnings, like better beginnings for what? And I think all of us who listen to our NPR stations and read the newspapers, the impact media newspaper stories, think, well, it's better beginnings because we care about children, right? They're not thinking better beginnings because BlackRock needs their portfolio assets put in place. Nobody's thinking about that. They're not thinking, these better beginnings come with surveillance play tables for kids in Head Start, which is happening with EduCare in North Tulsa, in other areas that they're not thinking better beginnings means tracking the social behavior of young children to manage them as human capital into this future of automation and remote robotic work, nobody's saying like, oh, when we say better beginnings, we actually mean this, right? And so I think that's really important to consider. So that's Gary investments. So the other thing is, when we were talking about the game, I wrote a long article focused on Mexico, which is where I think these policies were initially trialed in the early 1990s with Mexican officials, but they were trained in the US at Boston University and at Yale around conditional cash transfer payments. And so this was money, government assistance offered to particularly targeting poor women and their children. And the idea was, economic mobility or providing some stability. But it was conditional, and it was conditional with what was established as good parenting linked to provision of education and provision of health services and wellness visits. And essentially what had happened then is that the whole family gets pulled into the program and comes under surveillance. And whereas in the early to late 1990s, the cloud-based computing, the digital blockchain digital identities were not in place, that was starting to become normalized. And now these programs have spread to like 40 countries covering millions upon millions of low-income women. Now there's no imperative to actually say, wait a minute. Like the stuff that we're doing globally around this economic structure and debt finance and saddling the countries in the global south with all of this debt and keeping them from being able to make their own way, that's the problem. And why are these women poor in the first place? It's not because they're not interested in having opportunities to support their family in a reasonable way. It's that it's structured poverty. It's structured that way on purpose, and those women are made dependent on purpose. And I keep saying the frame for me is the indigenous genocide here in North America and the wild, wild west, and the intention of relocating people onto reservations so that they could not support themselves and their cultural practice. So this program of conditional cash transfers is something I hear very few people talking about, even though a lot of folks out there are talking about social control through digital currency. They're picturing like themselves, their middle class, professional class families in their suburban homes are going to be controlled. And that may very well be the case, but it's going to start with the poor first. It's going to start with people who are unhoused, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, and poor women and children. And those children is what they're after. And I hate to say it, like I wish the world were different and I didn't have to sit here outside this Capitol and say that. But I can't come to any other conclusion looking at how it's playing out and knowing Palantir is coming to Denver, that Peter Thiel's whole background is in digital payment systems. And so it's important to know that so in Philadelphia, there's something called the Benefits Data Trust, and it sounds lovely, right? Like we provide navigators to connect people with the public benefits that they're entitled to, because maybe you're an older person and you don't know how to work the system, you can't get online, you don't know what benefits are available to you. And but it's much bigger than that. They tell a story up front, but they have a much deeper program behind it. And so the people who are behind this Benefits Data Trust, which was launched in 2005, so that's a couple years before the Global Impact Investment Network and social impact investing started to scale through the Rockefeller Foundation. And remember, at that time, Judith Rodin was running it, and she was the former president at Penn. So a lot of this is embedded in Philadelphia, where I live, and many of the connections are specific to Philadelphia. But Colorado is another participant in this program. It's through the Colorado Health Foundation, and their pilot program in 2015 was food assistance to low-income seniors. And people would, and in Philadelphia, like the assistant was, heat assistance for low-income seniors, or training, this is our nudge unit, training social workers to be, have better training to deal with intake of the homeless, right? And that was all of the stuff. And it was about water bills, actually. Here, we're gonna create systems that, enable seniors to connect with reduced water bill payments. And you imagine, like, how could anyone say that's wrong, right? They pick the things up front. You're like, how can anybody say that's wrong? But they're not talking about conditional cash transfers and the larger incursions on people's family and culture and what that will mean. So these are some of the partners in the Benefits Data Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ballmer Group, and that's Steve Ballmer, formerly of Microsoft, and his wife is Connie, is part of Strive Together. That's that cradle to career pathway, right? So if you want the access to those benefits, you better get on the pathway and walk the walk. the Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, that's Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, Kaiser Permanente, the health system. They're also deeply involved in pay for success finance, especially around housing. The United Way, they run the poverty management program called ALICE for the working poor, assets limited, income constrained employed, that's Alice. The Robin Hood Foundation, which is Paul Tudor Jones, and he worked with Stanley Druckenmiller, essentially spending the last 30 years setting up all of the infrastructure of this as a test bed in Harlem, the Harlem Children's Zone, and Walmart. And again, we've had that conversation in Salt Lake City about Sam Walton and Walmart and his time, at Fort Douglas and supply chains and what all of that means. So, these are the people who want to help, right? But to what end? To what end? That's what I'm saying. So that's the conditional cash transfer. So in 2017 here in Colorado, there was a pre-K social impact bond for with the Westminster Public Schools, which was identified as a low-income school district. The Walton Family Foundation and the Peyton Foundation, now Gary Investments, provided this funding for 112 4-year-olds to participate in pre-K. Now again, if you look at the Salt Lake City Granite School District's social impact bond that was backed by Goldman Sachs, of the 100 children who were screened into the program, only one of them needed special education services at kindergarten enrollment, a number that the New York Times and many people in the philanthropy space said that's a really sketch number. Like that actually doesn't make sense. But Goldman Sachs made a lot of money off the backs of those children. And increasingly what we're seeing is online preschool. And this is this Waterford Upstart program that we've seen in Philadelphia. So keep your eyes out because it's connected to the Sorensen family in Salt Lake City. So these social impact bonds are already happening here in Colorado. In 2019, Hickenlooper had support for these pay for success deals for at-risk teens. Remember 2 years previous, they did sort of an open call for innovative solutions from stakeholders and nonprofits. House Bill 1323 allocated $6 million in public funding. And then there was private funding from Laura and John Arnold and Annie E. Casey Foundation. Now the Annie E. Casey Foundation has close ties to UPS. It's based in Baltimore. It's a very Catholic charity. Connie, it's connected with Strive Together as well, the Cradle to Career Pathways. And then John Arnold, I mentioned before, former energy futures trader, and that he was the one who was, cutting deals to do aerial surveillance of Baltimore as part of his sort of Better Bail projects and making predictive analytics about crime. And it was covert. It was nothing that the community had buy-in to. They didn't know about it till after it happened. So these are the people who are essentially monitoring or providing solutions for at-risk teens. Now, there were other partners in the program. University of Colorado Denver's Barton Institute for Philanthropy and Social Enterprise, because the academics are all part of this public-private partnership, and the UC Denver Center for Effective Interventions, right? So it's all about evidence-based and what works. And that's what pulls in the conservatives, because on this it is advancing fully bipartisan. So on the left-leaning side, you have people say, okay, well, those in need are being taken care of, right? And then the conservatives say, well, we're willing to pay for it, but only if you can prove that it works. But the what works part means that the people who are delivering the services and the people who are receiving the services have to be under digital surveillance. And whatever supports they receive have to be able to be scaled, which means it's digital. It means it's totally digital. So among the solutions, and there's also, there's the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab and Social Impact Solutions. So they were helping structure the deals. One of the cohorts was focused on Jefferson County foster care youth. And the program that was funded was called MST, Multi-Systemic Therapy, okay? So you picture that you have, so some of these are foster care kids and some of them are kids who have been involved in the judicial justice system, right? Some of it is aligning these youth to alternative training and workforce readiness. And again, those are all human capital markets. And again, those children will be directed to build the metaverse, very likely, or perhaps some sort of biotech job or some sort of cyber tech security job or possibly alternative energy. Those seem to be the areas that people are funneled into. But then also there's the mental health treatment aspect, which touches again on being at Palantir. So this MST therapy is a mental health therapy, and it actually, if you follow it back, It was used in Essex County, England, in the UK in 2013. Okay, and it is a cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, CBT therapy lends itself to digital interventions, like a CBT therapies in VR headsets, conditioning. They're not going to pay for you to have talk therapy with a trained licensed professional. They're going to create some sort of digital intervention or digital nudge or digital training program that they're going to literally program you so that they can get their data for their deal. And that's just the reality. If we accept pay for success finance as this new public-private partnership paradigm, that's how it's going to happen. So MST started in the UK. It was connected to the Government Outcomes Lab, and most of the mental health in the NHS in the UK goes back to Richard Layer's equation around depression and putting sort of a quantification on, you will provide therapy to someone based on lost economic productivity. Like, not because they're human beings and they deserve it, but you will use the lost economic productivity of mental illness to create the cost offset for these deals. Now, the consultant for this MST therapy, his name is Stephen Goldberg, and he is now with Caffeinated Capital, which is quite the name, but he was the first managing director of social finance, and that's Ronald Cohen, the father of impact investing and Harvard MBA alum. And in 2017, Goldberg actually wrote a paper called Scale Finance, Industrial Strength Social Impact Bonds for Mainstream Investors. Now, does that sound like something that's coming out of a caring place? Like, we care about people's needs? We care about preschoolers? We care about fathers? No. Let me just repeat this. He says, Scale Finance, industrial strength social impact bonds for mainstream investors. They're looking to scale it, all right? That's what's coming. Now, the other piece of this, are you all right? is it's cold here today. We keep going in and out of the sun. The workforce development. Okay, so these are at-risk youth. We have a whole nother category, which is training and reskilling, the lifelong learning model on the blockchain. And this will be C-Lab. This will be the Learning Economy Foundation, and it feeds into something called the Colorado Swiss Apprentice Model. Now, this links Colorado to the state of Washington, and this goes through a woman. Her name is Suzanne Levine, and her husband Eric. Now, Suzanne was deeply involved in labor economics in the state of Washington, both in the employment office, in this Career Connect program, in Rework America. She was on the board of the Markle Foundation, which we talked about yesterday. She was involved in finance for the DNC, and she was a bundler for Obama. She was also the ambassador to Switzerland between 2014 and 2017, okay? So when we're talking about blockchain, that's where it all is, the Zug Crypto Valley in Switzerland. So she was very well attuned, I'm sure, to what was happening in the blockchain space in terms of digital badging and the next phase of globalization, which is the remote robotic labor and telepresence labor. Now, they're going to try to tell people that this apprenticeship model is sort of like what we imagined it, right? Like, great, they're going to teach, kids good trades, right, that will help them earn a good living. They're going to have an up-to-date auto mechanic shop. They're going to have up-to-date carpentry, plumbing, and it will happen in schools with trained teachers who know how to work with kids. That's absolutely not what's going to happen. What they're going to do is they're going to put apprenticeship programs in VR headsets. And that's what's going to happen, and you're going to show your competencies, you're going to jump through the hoops, you're going to earn your badges, and you probably still won't get the job because there's 200 other people competing for that job, and it's very likely not going to be things that are actually useful to society. So they're counting on, when you say career and technical education, that most people are going to think about what they imagined when they were younger people, what it meant. That's not going to happen. That's going to be totally gutted, and the teachers are all working at cross purposes because they're not going to be teaching the CTE program. It's going to be mentors, and and some of those mentors are going to be AI and live in a device. Eric Levine, it's kind of odd. They were both with Microsoft, and then he moved on to found an app called Seller Tracker, which was for wine storage. So it's kind of an odd thing that he's doing Careerwise planning in Colorado. But he was on the board of Careerwise and the American Swiss Foundation. The funders of Careerwise included the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, United Healthcare, United Way, Walton again, Markle again, the Opportunity Scholarships, Michael Bloomberg, and JP Morgan Chase. These people are in it for the money. The model was advanced by Hickenlooper in 2017, and at that time, Suzanne Levine issued with Switzerland a joint declaration of intent for vocational education. So guess what, Colorado? You're connected to Washington State and Switzerland now. This is moving through something called Skillful. Skillful is, as I mentioned yesterday, the Markles program. It's connected to the Colorado Labor and Employment Division, Careerwise, Colorado Workforce Development Council. Their other partners include LinkedIn, Microsoft. Those are your stackable badges. Lumina, that's for betting on your outcome. For economic mobility, and Purdue. Now, Purdue University, it's important to note that they have the biggest online global university program out there. They also have our host to the Sentient World simulation with the digital twinning, and Melanie Swan, the crazy lady who's transhumanist and imagining that we're going to have blockchain nanobots run our neurons in our mind on blockchain. These are all in Purdue, right? So Purdue is a partner on this apprenticeship model, which people are thinking something like, oh, great, apprenticeships, like I can be a pastry chef. No, it's not that. It's not that at all. Walmart is also a partner. So one of the other states besides Colorado that's involved is the state of Indiana in Skillful. Now, I will just mention here, there's another program because people might imagine, well, how will pay for success work if the governments go bankrupt? Because ultimately, none of these people are paying taxes and the governments will go bankrupt. The next phase is something called an impact security that was developed by NPX. One of the co-founders of that came out of Wharton as well, and they've been working on a pilot called The Last Mile, which trains incarcerated people while they are in prison to do coding. So essentially the idea is that people will make more money in prison than they would doing other prison labor, and meanwhile they can undercut the regular market in coding. So that Last Mile program started in San Quentin in 2017, has many major investors. There's organizations called Mission Measurement, Impact Genome. It's all tracking, again, heightened surveillance. And they call these impact securities performance-backed debt for NGOs, and they're all aligned with the environmental social governance. So we can imagine, essentially, the metaverse is not going to be built on properly waged labor. It's going to be built on free labor or subsidized labor, and that's kids, prisoners, poor women, and refugees. That's who they're going to get to the grunt work of coding the metaverse. Now, in order to track you in your digital credentials and your services and the impact, what they need is an interoperable database system, and they will sell it as private and decentralized, but they need to get you on the blockchain to make this happen. Colorado started something called a digital service in 2019. Jared Polis set it up. It's in the governor's office of information technologies. And essentially they're there to provide digital services. And they're going to say something like, oh, it's super convenient. It's super convenient. But ultimately, it's about providing the accountability infrastructure for government contracts, for outcomes-based government contracting. Now, the departments that are involved in the state of Colorado are Personnel and Administration, Human Services, Labor and Employment, Public Safety, Public Health and Environment, Healthcare Policy and Finance, okay? So your wellness is all gonna be financed with Pay for Success. That puts you under surveillance with your step counts every single day. And e-health innovation, and that is your electronic health records on blockchain. And we talked a little bit about at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Okay, and so the outside partners include the U.S. Digital Response, the U.S. Digital Service, 18F with the General Services Administration, and that's tech and design consultancy, for the Beek Center at Georgetown, which is social impact finance, Schmidt Futures, that's Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google Alphabet, and Code for Denver, okay? So essentially, these are all folks who are going to sell you on the convenience of e-government and digital government. And of course, the lockdowns gave everybody a wonderful excuse to say, hey, you can't access us in person, but you can get us through a portal, right? You need your digital identity. That's where it's going. And so they had a link on their website for past work of this office. So I was curious, well, what were their projects? Well, the only project that was up was essentially managing the contact tracing for COVID, right? So it all goes back to like getting you on the blockchain under the guise of like, if you're a healthy person, you're a national security risk. If you don't have some sort of digital sensor device that says you're okay, that's all part of it. So this feeds to and I'm just sort of wrapping up here, but the Colorado Digital Identity Program. So, again, in the name of convenience, they're going to say, hey, you could just keep your driver's license on your phone, not to mention sometimes like your phone, battery dies or whatever. But that's the selling point. That was issued, the setup for that by Governor Polis by Executive Order B 2019-13. They're using it to regulate, you can use your digital ID for liquor purchases and marijuana. And so I was just telling Jason, I feel really strongly that the legalization of marijuana and probably at some point sort of controlled psychoactive drugs will be linked to your digital identity, because the mental health system and the wellness, they will want to track the impact of these other kinds of medical uses into their impact deals, right? And so they need that tied to your digital identity. It's law enforcement, okay, and the Colorado State Patrol, that's no surprise, that meshes with the digital driver's license. But they're also looking, and then Department of Revenue, that's linked to your motor vehicle registration. But here we have Colorado WIC, which is, providing food for low-income women and infants. And that goes back to the conditional cash transfer I was talking about. They're regulating natural resources, so parks and fishing licenses. So if you can imagine in terms of the enclosures, they really want people to be dependent, and they want you not to be able to access things outside of these mega region areas, the smart city urban areas. So, I can foresee a day where instead of just the convenience of having your camping permit or your fishing license on your phone, that it's going to be a requirement. Like, you're not going to be able to get into public space without showing that you have the proper credentials, whatever they deem. And for now, they have a vaccine element on this phone. For now, maybe it's the vaccine, but in the future, who knows what other conditional elements you might have to earn the right to access these public spaces. And the last one, and this will sort of, I think, wrap us up, is the Mental Health Center of Denver has patient check-in. And, I'm just in closing saying, it's really hard to imagine, we're sitting here in these cities, and on the surface, they all seem so normal. But pretty soon it's going to not feel like, for many of us already, we don't feel normal in these spaces because we know it's underway. But the mental health crises that we had before the lockdowns of the past 2 years are going to be exponentially worse as more people are pushed out of jobs, as more people are put on pathways that don't feel right for them, that feel coercive, as, we become colonized by more and more biotechnology and synthetic biology, both in our bodies and in our environments. They know that there's going to be a lot of mental health, and so they're building the impact markets around that. And they're going to create, my sense is, a lot of alternative wellness providers to service low-income populations and vulnerable populations that fall under this what works component. As I said, you fit all of this together, combined with what I said at the previous site visit about opportunity zones, special economic zones that they can create, sort of these digital company towns, sort of cordon up these communities and put them in essentially a digital game board. And I really, if you haven't watched my talk in Tucson about smart cities and this game, right, this mixed reality video game that is going to be coming with digital identity on blockchain to feed the global brain, pay for success finance, and privatize social services, privatize people. Seriously, my liberal and progressive and leftist friends, please understand that these public-private partnerships are turning the most at-risk people into pawns in something like, the game has already been underway. I mean, I think if you're a low-income person, you know that there's a shitty game out there, and you work through the paces and you hope to survive it, right? And a lot of people don't. But this thing that's coming, the level of coercion with ubiquitous computing, I think it's going to be beyond what we can even contemplate right now. And I don't mean to scare you, but I'm trying to come from the right place. I don't think any of us would want this, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. Even people who are on the conservative side, you wouldn't want to be having your public entities investing in the poverty of other people. You don't want to be a part of that either. People of faith don't want to be a part of that. If you just knew. And right now, it's spell casting what they're doing. They have very, very compelling propaganda to create enchantments that make people think that they're doing the right thing. Whether they're building the Panopticon or whether they're a service provider or navigator in it, or, you know, and I'm not sure how we neutralize this other than by awakening to the reality of it. So, you know, Colorado is right in the center. There's some other states, you know, we have friends in Texas. Texas is the center of this. Florida is the center for this. You know, Wyoming is a part of it. Just in closing, I will say, you know, my last thing about Colorado is that the largest digital identity deployment right now is in Ethiopia. It started off with students and teachers, so that would be in alignment with a lot of the Pay for Success finance that Polis put in the ESSA, but it's in Ethiopia, and this would be connected to education systems linked to the World Bank Human Capital Finance, UN Sustainable Development Goal 4, and that's happening through Cardano. And Cardano, our Cardano Atala Prism, I think, is the component there. And Charles Hoskinson of Cardano, it lives in Guffey, Colorado. You know, according to his LinkedIn, that's what it says. He's working with Carnegie Mellon University, and he's working with Hanson Robotics, and that's Ben Gertzel, that's Sophia and Grace, these humanoid robots that have a shared brain. That's this blockchain brain. And so as poor people, children, at-risk communities navigate this game, all of the data of being human in that game is going to be fed into the blockchain brain, and that's going to go through the impact data fulfillment, which is Ocean Protocol, that's in connection with SingularityNet, which is using AI to move data around to attempt to catalyze conscious machines. And I don't think that they'll actually be able to do that, because clearly machines are not going to have a soul, but I think that they're going to try really hard to capture that in people. And poor people are really resilient, and they're really creative, and that data is the data that they want for their robots, because they want to be able to like figure out every different option in this asymmetrical warfare game that they're gonna, you know, wrap in, you know, sponge sugar and lollipops and rainbows and try to sell it to you. So just don't fall for it.